Thanks everyone for joining. And again, it's so great to have so many people from really all across the globe, from many countries. And for those who haven't attended one of these webinars, a little bit about the interface. We have this chat window that you can be part of. I would love to know where you're coming from. This is truly, again, a global audience, so I would love to hear that from you. There's also an ask a question little widget, a prompt at the bottom of the screen. This is something that you can use as I'm presenting. So if you have a pending question, if you want to pose that straight away, you can use that little widget. And then you can actually also vote on other questions. And those are probably the ones with most votes are probably the ones that I'm going to tackle first once we get to the QA session at the very end of this short webinar. All right? So let's get started. I'm just going to maximize this a little bit. All right, so now you can probably see my screen a little bit better. So again, for those who are new, this is our third webinar as part of our weekly design principles series. This is where we have one new design principle every week, every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, US. The goal of this series of webinars every week is really for us to try and get as many insights as we can from cognitive science, right? From areas of attention, perception, memory, and emotion. In many ways, the goal of this series is for us to translate cognitive behaviors into holistic design principles that we can apply to UX, user experience, to graphic design, data visualization, and many other domains. In many ways, I want this to be a creative toolbox for you, for all of you to use in your practice, right? And something that you can come back to whenever you need to. And this creative toolbox, right, is really made up of principles. And I love the word principle. I love the general idea of a principle because it gives you this high-level plan, right? It's never a prescriptive or specific list of steps that you have to make, right? It's an abstract notion, an abstract idea. But it also describes this fundamental quality or attribute determining the nature of something. And we're going to look at a few examples as we go forward with this series. Today, we're going to talk about beauty, okay? So I want to start talking about beauty by mentioning two common misconceptions, and misconceptions that even I had for a long period of time, right? And that have really affected my life, both personally and as a professional, as a designer. Misconception number one is really the notion that beauty equals perfection, right? That beauty is the outcome of order, balance, and symmetry. And we're going to look a little bit at these two misconceptions. Misconception number two is that beauty is different from function, the eternal form versus function, right? That beauty and function are two opposite sides of a spectrum. The first misconception, that beauty equals perfection, goes all the way back to Aristotle. And I absolutely love this description, but it tells only one aspect of beauty. However, this has actually been the norm. The normal sort of acceptance of beauty has lasted for centuries through this statement by Aristotle, right? That beauty is all about balance, right? It's all about symmetrical shapes. It's all about the sense of order, right, in the chaos. And we can see this throughout, of course, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, that are really across architecture, design, and painting. But of course, I growing up as a creative inclined professional, as a young designer, I always felt there was just one side of the story, right? And it was really when I discovered the beautiful and fascinating work of network visualization and many related artistic developments in generative art and network art that I absolutely fell in love. And I knew there was more to beauty than just order and symmetry and balance, right? This is a great piece by Marius Watts. It's actually on the early pages of my first book, Visual Complexity. And this is, again, an example of why networks are immensely beautiful, right? And they are all but symmetrical, ordered, and balanced in many ways. You look at this, you don't have any of the senses that you had in some of those Renaissance paintings. And so much so that I actually wanted to write really an alternative view of beauty. And I did that in my first book, Visual Complexity. There's a whole chapter on complex beauty, where I try to explain why we humans are also equally attracted to complex structures like networks. Not just, again, the old notion, classical ideal of beauty, but the new idea of beauty, one that's all about complexity, that's really about intricateness in many ways, right? So I explored the work of Pollock, I explored many generative artists, many artists under this new sort of movement called networkism that are really trying to explore the boundaries of what beauty means for us. And this is actually the last sentence of that chapter on complex beauty. I wrote the following: networks show us that there is order in disorder, that there is unity in diversity, and above all, that complexity is astonishingly beautiful. And this is actually something that I really believe. And it's something that, in many ways, I feel like I need to write another book on this at some point in the future, because it's a really important statement that we don't need to be attached to this classical notion of beauty equals perfection, right? Beauty is really, really pluralistic. It's really, really nuanced and can adopt many different shapes and styles. And by the way, these are actually just a few paintings that I highlighted in the book. And these are beautiful paintings done by Sharon Malloy using oil and enamel on canvas. These are called transient structures and unstable networks, right? Beautiful, intricate paintings. Some of them are using oil on canvas. Others are actually using graphite. Some of these paintings have a lot of meaning for the people that put it. It actually reflects different structures in their own mind. So that was one misconception that I was trying to sort of change during my lifetime. The other one is, of course, all about form and function. And I think this specific quote by Wim Crowell that says, "I'm a functionalist troubled by aesthetics," is the best description to an internal struggle I had for so many years, right? By feeling that somehow aesthetics and function, form and function, were almost mutually exclusive concepts, right? That you had to choose one or the other. You could never have both, right? And I think that's a misconception that sometimes we see, across, our daily lives. And I think this is such a beautiful quote that really encapsulates my own internal struggle, but I'm sure many of you on the call have the same sort of internal struggle between beauty and function. I'm a functionalist troubled by aesthetics. It's quite a poetic one. And so much so that I remember writing this information visualization manifesto in 2009, and at that moment in time, I was all about function. I felt that function, if we had to choose one, I would always choose function. And one of the pieces of this manifesto was titled, "Do not glorify aesthetics." I was really making a stance against beauty, against aesthetics, right? And this was also, of course, at a time when there was a lot of exploration, there was a lot of experimentation, and there was a lot of gratuitous types of projects being made in this specific area. But it tells you a little bit about this internal struggle that I always had. And I changed a little bit my mind on this, right? So that's actually why I'm crossing this. And I'm going to tell you why I changed my mind on this specific spectrum. So this internal debate of mine that maybe others feel the same way, it's really part of this huge eternal debate that's been lasted for centuries on beauty and utility, right? On form versus function, on aesthetics versus usability. And again, the sort of the stereotypical notion is that these are two opposite ends of the spectrum. They are somehow mutually exclusive. You have to pick one or the other, right? Which is a very sort of simplistic way of looking at this problem. If there was actually a spectrum of sorts, it would look more like a matrix like this, right? Where you had objects that are more beautiful and others that are less beautiful or ugly, some that are functional and others that are non-functional. And notice how the spectrum, that simplistic spectrum, only explores two quadrants, right? What you might call the superficial quadrant, things that are highly beautiful but not so functional, and things that are very functional but not as beautiful, right? Which is the utilitarian approach, right? But again, these are the usual stereotypes of form and function. Rarely people explore this quadrant, maybe for a reason, but it is actually a very common occurrence and normally ignored by people, right? The futile, I would call this the futile, which is something that is not aspirational by any standards, right? It's not only it's actually non-functional, it doesn't work properly, but it's also ugly. So it's like, it's the worst of both worlds, right? But no one really mentions this. And it's, again, unfortunate, I'm sure all of you, hopefully, maybe even on a daily basis, encounter examples that fall into this area. And then, of course, there's also one quadrant that's not mentioned frequently, right? Because again, it doesn't fall into this simplistic spectrum of form and function, which is the desirable, right? And this quadrant is not a unicorn. It is, in fact, a very attainable outcome. Take Apple products, for example. They fall into this quadrant pretty well, right? They are both functional and beautiful at the same time. So it's not a unicorn. It's not an impossible outcome altogether. And perhaps we need a different sort of idea of what beauty means, right? Beauty in design is less about aesthetic beauty and more about how well it helps us perform certain tasks, right? So it's really about, it's not a superficial thing that you impose on a product or an experience. It's really about the inner workings of it, right? So it's the nuances, the way that it operates, the way that it moves, the way that it reacts to what you are doing. It's the way that it's built, how it all comes together, all the different pieces. So in many ways, the common sort of adage that beauty comes from within, I think it's still very much the case for what we consider to be beautiful or elegant products, right? But the principle today that I want to talk about has really completely changed my mind on some of the misconceptions, right? And it really put aesthetic at the forecenter of usability. And so much so that, again, as I mentioned before, the manifesto from a few years back, I would definitely revisit that and change that, primarily through some of the discoveries. And this principle has been a really important influence in my past 10 years or so. This principle is called the aesthetic usability effect. And what it tells us is that aesthetic designs are perceived as easier to use than less aesthetic designs, right? This has actually been proven by Japanese researchers back in 1995 in a study that they did using an ATM interface, and has been validated ever since, right? And again, this is critical because, again, aesthetic, people think, again, these are not things that you can pick. Aesthetics actually plays a huge role in increasing the usability of a product. And it's all about perception. It doesn't even matter if it's actually more functional, but the perception you get is that it's more usable because it's beautiful, right? And not only that, but we are also more forgiving when we are faced with beautiful products. And this is actually part of a bias that it's called the attractive bias. We are more forgiving of beautiful products as we are of beautiful people, by the way. If someone does something to you that you don't like, you tend to forgive that person based on the ratio of beauty, which is a fascinating study as part of the attractiveness bias. But products, right, is a really interesting outcome because I actually tell this to engineers all the time. By creating a beautiful product, by really investing in fit and finish, in the attention to detail, right, in product excellence, what you are actually doing, you are avoiding an increase of bugs that might get along your way, right? Because people are more forgiving if it's a beautiful product, right? You can think about maybe maybe there are actually studies on this, like how often do people throw Apple products out of the window, right? Because they don't work properly. It's not that they probably have the same feelings as other products, right? But again, because they are so beautiful and so well crafted, we tend to be more forgiving, right? And that's a hugely important aspect of usability, okay? Because you don't complain as often, you don't actually submit a bug as often. So everyone wins, right, by doing this investment in aesthetics. And of course, many companies have explored this principle to a great degree. Think of many more, of course, can come to mind, but think about Nike, think about Apple, thinking about how certain products, by investing in, again, fit and finish, in product excellence, have really opened a whole new window within the market just by that investment alone. And you can argue that in data visualization, you feel the same thing, right? Again, we look at these products, and some of them, especially, these are two good examples. They are, of course, using circles for a separate reason, because it's one of the most alluring shapes for humans, which, again, that would be probably the topic for a separate webinar on circles alone. But notice how some of these might not even be the most effective and the most usable, at least inherently usable. But you tend to perceive them as more usable, and you are more forgiving of the shortcomings of these explorations because they are beautiful, right? Because you look at them and they are extremely alluring. Another example is a common radial construct that is used in circular diagrams that normally plots a timeline within a circle, right? And this has, of course, been proven, and it doesn't take too much time for you to think about why that is problematic. That is much harder to actually see progression in time on a circle than it is on a flat line, right? Because it's much harder to actually compare the differences between heights, right? If it's a bar chart or if it's a plotted line. But that, of course, doesn't stop people from doing this. And again, some of these projects are not as effective as I was mentioning, but they are immensely beautiful, right? So again, people perceive them to be more usable and are more forgiving, okay? In other words, Donald Norman says this in a really simple way. Attractive things work better. Again, even if it's just a perception, it doesn't matter, right? They just work better. So here we have this final sort of wrapping of this principle that, again, beauty and function are not two opposite ends of the spectrum. They can actually complement each other, right? And aesthetics can play a huge role in usability. And finally, some related principles. There's, of course, the attractiveness bias that I mentioned briefly. You can actually look it up, and there's a lot of reading material to do on this alone. There is, of course, the recognition over recall. One of the reasons why we love symbols and visual representations so much, because it's easier for us to recognize a visual representation than it is for us to recall something from memory. And another interesting bias, which is the gloss bias. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this bias, but it's really something that we have an innate preference for shiny objects. And you can see this, how people explore this, in cars, in tech devices, and many other areas. Some theories try to explain that in the sense that it's the water component, right? Like it shows proximity to water in some way. But there's debate about what's the reason. So the interesting thing about many of these biases is that we know they are there. Now the explanation as to why they are there is a matter of debate at times, right? So if you really want to, again, delve into some of these biases and many more, you should look at this amazing list of cognitive biases in Wikipedia. It's arguably my favorite Wikipedia page. It's called List of Cognitive Biases. And so this is it. This is 20 minutes principle. This is a short version, a digestible version of a webinar. For those that are new, it takes roughly 20 minutes. And we're going to follow up with QA. I just want to say that if you want to follow me on Twitter, this is my alias, MSLima, MSLIMA. It's probably the best way to be notified of future events that I might be doing related to this particular series, but I might be doing other panels, interviews, and things of that nature. So if you want to be notified of those beforehand, you can just follow me on Twitter. And again, the alias is MS Lima. You can also, of course, follow me right here on Crowdcast. Many of you have already done so, and you get notified immediately when a given event goes live. You can actually just do that by using that little green button on the very top that says follow. So if you click on that, you will immediately follow me here, and again, be notified of future events when they go up. And so now I open the floor for QA, which is always a fun part of these webinars. All right, so great. So I'm gonna use the Ask a Question widget for some of the initial questions. So if you guys want to ask a question there or vote on others, please do so. And then I might go to the chat if there are other questions there. Okay, so let me see. The first one is Daria asks, but oftentimes beauty is so subjective. Oh, okay, wait, it keeps on changing. So apparently Nix just got upvoted. So we have 3 votes on Nix. Great way to go, Nix. What are your thoughts on the aesthetics versus accessibility relationship? Wow, that's a really interesting point. I never thought about that. I don't know. I don't think there's a lot of research done on this necessarily. I mean, of course, you can consider usability to be an element of accessibility, right? So that's really the gist of this specific principle, is the connection between usability and aesthetics. Accessibility, I would imagine, that people with any type of shortcoming from an accessibility standpoint will be, of course, as humans, as receptive to beauty, as receptive to aesthetics as any of us would, right? So I would imagine that bias for beauty, right, that predisposition for aesthetics is implicit in anyone. So I would suspect a similar type of relationship. But on accessibility alone, I think accessibility is a huge point that we are actually investing a lot in recent times. I'm actually going to announce some work that we're doing on data visualization as part of my team at Google. And it's going to be some really fun studies, because again, I wish more people will look deeply into accessibility from with that in mind, specifically in the domain of data visualization. So a lot of votes on that. Nix, let me know if you want to have a follow-up question to this. I'm happy to follow up. The second question is by Daria, but oftentimes beauty is so subjective. How can we define it? What would beauty be in your perspective? Wow, that's such a tough question. Yes, it is. Of course, it's definitely a very subjective concept, beauty, right? I don't know if there's a definition of beauty. I mean, again, we go back to Aristotle's having this classical definition of beauty, which is all about order, balance, symmetry, and balance. Maybe I said it already, but I think there's other conceptions of beauty, right? And I think everyone has a different conception, which is always something that I felt strongly against just one single view of beauty. Having said that, there are indications, for example, on people that we are very attracted to people that express more symmetrical looks, right, in the shape of your face. If it's more symmetrical, we actually tend to have an innate preference for symmetry in that context. So that could be a sign of beauty. But again, do you call that beauty? I mean, you might also be attracted to some things that don't fall into that, but they are not maybe considered to be beautiful. So there's a lot of room for interpretation. But I think when it comes to design, right, it goes back to this element of like playing with the main construct from a graphical standpoint, right? This graphical language that you are used, if this is a case of graphical design, of using color, right? Using shape, using gloss material, right? Like shiny things. There's a combination of factors. For example, rounded curves. We actually have a huge preference for rounded objects, which actually is something, a research that I found during my book of circles, as I was working on the book of circles. And it's a fascinating study, which actually could explain why rounded fonts are so popular, right? Still to this day. And many designers hate rounded fonts, but a lot of people love them because, again, we have this implicit preference for rounded shapes, which is something that goes back to, again, I could spend a long time explaining the evolutionary basics of this. But in nature, angular shapes, right, shapes that end on an edge of some sort, are normally a sign of danger. Think about the edge of a rock, the teeth of an animal. Those are things you don't want to get close because they could actually kill you. In opposition, things that are rounded are normally a sign of comfort, of safety, right? So I think beauty, at least from an evolutionary standpoint, falls into some of these innate preferences we have for the surrounding world, both in terms of color, right, in terms of shapes. Another great principle that I forgot to mention is the savanna preference, right? Remember Windows, I think 95, the home screen was this like beautiful greenery field with like blue sky. This is actually tying to our savanna preference. Like we like to see, we have a strong preference for even paintings or representations that show a green field, some element of water, and a blue sky, right? So there's, again, a lot of these, again, innate sort of preferences that could explain what we consider to be beauty. I think it's really more about attraction. Beauty is just more of an artificial construct that we have created over time. So another question from Daria. Hopefully that was the answer that you were looking for, Daria. Pleasurable emotional response, delight, joy. Yes, absolutely. I think delight and joy is such an important element of what makes what we consider to be a beautiful object or experience. What are your thoughts on this? Form follows function or function follows form? Of course, you had to ask. Darshan, you had to ask this. It's tough, right? I mean, I think function follows form in many ways, in the sense that it is the beauty of things, and you go back to nature, some of the things that we consider to be beautiful or safe emerged in such a way by function alone, right? Now, again, never forget the importance of form. It's not they are not mutually exclusive, right? They're not opposite ends of a spectrum. They can be highly complementary, right? And in many ways, a beautiful project can really increase your perception of usability. Do you see a connection between what is beautiful and the relationship between general and private? Connection between essence and usability? Connection between what is beautiful and the relationship between general and private? That's a hard one, Alon. I think I'm going to have to answer that. Whoa, this keeps on changing. Sorry. I'm going to have to follow up on your question later on, Alon, if you don't mind. There's a lot of questions here. I'm trying to cover all of them. Nix asks, based on your experience and considering how ingrained beauty standards are, how receptive is the industry to research and new findings that may possibly oppose existing assumptions? For example, the flow between UX research and UI. I think absolutely, just go for it. I don't think there's any sort of immediate reluctance of the industry to this. I think in many ways, this is, of course, my view. I would say that they are actually they are welcoming of studies of that sort that, again, bring a novel light into this debate between form and function. Anna asks, ephemeral versus timeless beauty. It's a duality I found in so many different creative fields. Could we discuss this a bit more? Yes, I would love to. Ephemeral versus timeless beauty. Yes, I think so. There's something to say about timeless design, right? This thing that never gets out of fashion. I was writing a post the other day about Ari Beck, who did, of course, the 1933 London Underground map that really changed our notion of what a subway system map could be. And it's almost as if it was created yesterday, and it's almost a century old. It's pretty remarkable, right? I think there's ephemeral, there's timeless. I think another component, Anna, that I would add is the natural wear and tear. And I've been obsessed about this, maybe because of my background in industrial design, in physical product design, that I feel sometimes, the digital realm lacks the natural wear and tear. Like the stories that you associate with objects are part of the wear and tear. You look at a book and then you see like a coffee stain and you associate that with maybe you were having a coffee with a friend somewhere. Maybe you folded that page when you were in the beach. There's grains of sand. Like there's all these stories that objects tell us through wear and tear. And again, a PDF looks exactly the same 10 years ago as it looks today. So I think you lose that element of associating things with stories, which is such a rich part of our own human existence, right? Not a question. So Vamsi asks, not a question. This is so true. A simple example. When I present my wireframes to the product dev teams, I got a million questions versus art directors presenting the visuals for the same wireframes. Interesting to know that aesthetically more visual designs please the human mindset. Yes, that's the power. I mean, again, a lot of these principles are weapons. I mean, are weapons for many of you guys to use, like in a design review, in a stakeholder review, whatever that context is. If you are looking for arguments to defend a given solution, these are weapons that you can use, right? And saying, hey, this is not just arbitrarily beautiful, right? Beauty has a huge play in usability, right? And let me show you how. Would you consider beauty an aesthetic function? I think so. I do think so. Luigi asks this, would you consider beauty an aesthetic function? I do think so. That's very much the case. I think that's what this aesthetic usability effect kind of proves, right? So I think that's a really good way of putting it, Luigi. And again, to be honest, like even though I've been more lately than before, being a great sort of advocate of beauty and aesthetics, I know they can also have some negative connotations. And in many ways, I also choose a word that is probably more popular because it can please any type of audience, which is the word elegant. So if I'm describing something that's beautiful, I tend to use the word elegant, well, depending on the context, but I tend to use the word elegant more often. And I use that only because it's a word that has a very similar meaning both for the design and art community and the scientific engineering community, right? Because they can also relate, engineering and science community can also relate to the concept of elegance, right? They use this all the time. An elegant piece of code, right? An elegant formula that someone was able to make, an elegant theory, right? The notion of elegance is actually something that's a little bit more understandable on both sides. And I tend to find that specific word or term a bit more successful when talking about beauty and aesthetics, which is also maybe something that describes the beauty in design, which is, again, the construct. It's about the full experience. It's not about just a superficial look and feel. All right, so I think we are just over time. I would definitely want to thank you all for attending. Hopefully this was an interesting discussion. I would love to even try at another version of this, maybe next week, that people that actually want to ask questions, there's a way I can do here on Crowdcast to actually, hopefully this is not too much putting you on the spot, but if you are willing, right, maybe you can raise your hand metaphorically here on this interface, and I can actually share, you can actually share your screen. So it could be a more of an interesting debate here instead of just me answering these questions. So if you are keen on that, maybe that's something that we can explore in our next webinar next Wednesday. That could be fun. I think that's most of the questions from people. Natalie makes a point here. I read an article on beauty versus function mistake, and it mentions a study by NECSI on people's mood based on their tweets, the sentiment of New York City, if not mistaken. And they found that people were mostly angry while at Penn Station. I'm not surprised. And mostly happy at Grand Central. The author reminds us that Penn Station is ugly and Grand Central is beautiful. Yes, it's not just ugly, it's also immensely claustrophobic. And I mean, if there's one, I mean, I look at some of I don't know if you've seen those ancient photos of what old Penn Station looked like. It was a beautiful building. It's one of those huge crimes that were made in name of progressive modernism, right? And they thought that putting, thousands of people underground was the way to go for the future. And yes, I actually cringe every time I have to go to Penn Station. I absolutely cringe. I think it's just such an horrible experience. it's not just ugly, but it's also immensely claustrophobic. The low ceilings, everything is just so, it's such an anxiety-inducing experience altogether. So this is great. Natalie, if you want to share that article that you saw, that would be great. All right, thank you so much for this session. Yeah, Old Penn Station. Yeah, you need to look it up, images of Old Penn Station, remarkable stuff. So thank you so much for attending this short webinar. Again, I'm gonna post this on YouTube after this maybe tomorrow or the day after. So you can also see the recording on YouTube. So thank you so much, and looking forward to see many of you next week. All right, stay safe, everyone. Take care.